Greetings, I'm Keith Klein, the host of the VentureFizz Podcast, where I interview the most fascinating people in the tech scene. This is episode 386, and today's guest is Shahid Azim, managing partner and CEO of C10 Labs, an AI venture fund and studio. When ChatGPT was released towards the end of 2022, it changed everything, and the AI era officially began. It was perfect timing for Shahid and his two co-founders of C10 Labs, that being Professor Ramesh Raskar and Dr. Patricia Geli, as the organization was born out of a course they were co-instructors on called AI for Impact. They knew the time was now, and it was an opportunity to build a market-leading venture studio that is specifically focused on AI-first companies. They were early to the movement and helped create the spark for the AI ecosystem in the Boston area. Fast forward to today, Shahid and the team at C10 Labs are deeply involved in creating the core foundation for AI in the Boston tech ecosystem, from the startups that are participating in their accelerator to playing a key role in lots of other initiatives like the Massachusetts AI Hub. Overall, C10 Labs is making a major impact. In this episode of our podcast, we cover lots of great topics, like the details about how C10 Labs came to fruition, Shahid's background story and his journey into entrepreneurship, the details about Shahid's startups, which focused on lots of important matters like brain health or heart health, like Qantas, a VC-backed company with groundbreaking tech for a continuous blood pressure monitoring wearable device that came before the launch of the Apple Watch, all about C10 Labs and what companies can expect by going through their program, the criteria they look for while reviewing companies for their accelerator, and the details on their upcoming AI biology cohort this fall, common stumbling blocks for native AI companies, and so much more. All right, quick side note. Is your company hiring? If the answer is yes, then what are you doing to build up your company's employment brand? If you don't have a content strategy, then it is highly likely that you're just flying under the radar. The good news is that VentureFizz can help. A subscription includes a content playbook for sharing all the details on your company, people, and culture. We leverage all formats of storytelling to include video, podcasting, employee profiles, and more. Reach out to info@venturefizz.com to get all the details. All right, without further ado, here's my interview with Shahid. Shahid, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, pleasure to be here. Thanks, Keith. Looking forward to having a little chat today.
I was excited to talk to you. We met, I don't know, it was like 9 months ago or whenever it was, and we were talking about C10 Labs. So when I think of the Boston tech ecosystem and the whole AI evolution of what's happening, I view you and C10 Labs as a real anchor to making all this happen. So I just wanted to start the conversation by talking about just that. So what is going on in the Boston tech ecosystem in relation to AI?
So, firstly, thank you for inquiring about C10 and appreciate the sentiments. I think what it might be useful to give a little context in terms of just how and when we started, and that'll give you a sense of the role that we've played over the last 3 years at this point. So myself and my two other co-founders, Professor Ramesh Raskar and Dr. Patricia Geli, we were co-instructors at the MIT Media Lab for a course called AI for Impact. And essentially, the course was really designed to identify these large unmet needs, societal scale, right? And how to use technology to solve these problems. And it happened to be the moment where we all experienced, OpenAI's product release, and the rest is kind of history, because suddenly everybody on the planet had access to, a fairly sophisticated first version of an AI platform that was now not just doing things like what Google has sort of made so pervasive, which is like, ability to search anything on the planet. But it was really connecting the dots, bringing a lot more context to the intelligence in the search layer. And so with that moment sort of that we experienced, it was sort of very obvious that this is different. And there was a real need in the ecosystem to take what we were doing at MIT, but really make it available and accessible to anyone in the ecosystem. And so the seeds of what we're now building at C10 really started with this open innovation mindset of bringing a lot of different stakeholders together and looking at these problem sets and trying to find the best solution for it. And so, to your question in terms of our role and what we do and how did it all begin, we were really inspired to one thing differently about early stage venture creation. My background has been in early stage I've done a number of these venture backed companies based on licensed technologies at MIT, and the journey, even in a very, very rich ecosystem like Boston or it's still fraught with friction and inefficiencies, and it still takes, even if you've done it multiple times, I've always felt like there's a better way of starting these companies where if you have the sandbox, where you have all the right stakeholders and capital and resources, hopefully it'll allow some of these really, really big transformative ideas to emerge and accelerate. And so the thesis behind C10 is exactly that we're kind of experiencing this super important moment with AI. And we need a mechanism for these best ideas and best teams to emerge and accelerate and build products that need to exist, essentially. And so over the last over 2 years now, we've been in the process of raising our first fund, which we've been deploying, and we have a number of companies in our portfolio at this stage. But the real sort of vision behind C10 was a lot more than just an early stage venture fund. We wanted to create a platform that allowed some of these big, best ideas to emerge, and then to also think differently, which is, we'll get a chance to talk about some of the initiatives that we've done, but we've been trying to create a lot more open innovation and collaboration with academic labs, corporates, various ecosystems, to surface these ideas and surface these teams and then help them accelerate. So long-winded answer to your question, but we got involved very early on, and we've been just trying to make sure that we're supporting the ecosystem in ways that allows these teams and the best ideas to emerge and succeed.
Yeah, because like the Mass AI Hub, right? Like that's a massive initiative with a lot of different, organizations involved. So it's a very collaborative effort.
Yes, and what we've done over the last couple of years now is that the first part of, actually, there's a three-pronged strategy. And one core element of what we do at C10 is activating the ecosystem. So when we started, there weren't too many people or let's say organizations that were specifically focused on AI. There were a lot of obviously early stage funds, and it's such a dynamic environment that we're in Kendall Square. But nobody was really saying, "Hey, this is a unique moment that requires a slightly different level of thinking." And the first phase of that is let's activate the ecosystem. Let's bring the people who can actually build these products, the labs that are researching in this space, the corporates that are interested in listening and supporting these ideas together. And we did that. So we've done that sort of thematically, for example. So we hosted one of the first and the most well-attended event around AI and the built world last year at the MIT Media Lab, where we had almost, 400 to 500 people. And similarly, we're now, and the idea was that, hey, let's pick an area that perhaps isn't really getting all the spotlight. Like, let's build at the intersection of these disciplines where you can unlock a lot of latent value. And so built world is one where obviously, it's It's a massive part of the economy, just like healthcare, but it hasn't necessarily attracted the AI talent or startup focus. And so a lot of the things that we've done over the last 2 years have really been in the service of activating the ecosystem.
All right, well, let's take a walk through your background, because the path is going to show us that you're uniquely qualified to do what you're doing now. So where'd you grow up? What were you like as a child?
Sure. So I grew up in Pakistan, actually, in Islamabad. I was born there and spent the first 12 years of my life, 12 years of my schooling there. And I was always fascinated by technology and, a big time Trekkie, right? So growing up, my favorite show was Star Trek, and I've watched it many times over. And actually, some of the companies that I started later on in my life were very much inspired by the science fiction books and programs that I've seen. But much of my early life was really, I spent there, moved for my undergrad to the U.S. Many years ago, so that was sort of my journey. As soon as I realized that I wanted to build with technology and sort of be on the leading edge, I realized that I had to go to the center of gravity, which is the U.S., right? So both for knowledge as well as work.
And did you always consider yourself entrepreneurial? Like that was always something that you considered yourself, building companies?
I made a list probably when I was late in my middle school of about 20 things that I wanted to achieve in life. And probably the second or the third thing on that list was that I wanted to own my own business and start companies. So basically, and I still have that list actually. So to answer your question, I always had this idea that this is entrepreneurship. Didn't really call it entrepreneurship when I was in middle school, but it was more like, starting ventures or starting a business is a great way to drive or chase your dreams or drive impact. And that has been sort of the consistent theme, if I look back, among a few other things. But so one, having, the ability to control one's destiny as well as make an impact is massively enticing.
All right, so perfect segue into building companies. So you went off to pursue your graduate studies, and was it at MIT Sloan that was kind of where you started your first company?
I had actually built a company. I built a company between 2002 and 2007. And sold it in 2007. And this was a BPO company, actually. So we were basically providing business process outsourcing. But it was interesting. We started in very basic sort of technology services and outsourcing, but we ended up in spend analytics, which is a very specialized field. We were helping large financial institutions figure out how to save money. So, for example, if you're Deutsche Bank, you have to buy all the way from like pencils to G5 aircrafts, and you're spending something like, $15 to $20 billion a year. And so how do you create efficiencies across that kind of scale? And we ended up, so that was the company that I built and sold. It was called Braintree Group in 2007. And then came to Sloan with the idea of wanting to start my next venture. So I had one under my belt where I had built something from scratch, and we scaled it to about 150 people. But again, the way I talk about my professional journey is like, that was, it was really at MIT Sloan where it allowed me to take the next step up and say, okay, always wanted to build products. At the intersection of like breakthrough science and engineering. I think it was like being a kid in a candy store, right? You're meeting with all these incredible minds and professors, and that's essentially how I started my first venture. To you, coming back, long-winded way of coming back to your question. I started my first venture right out of my MBA at Sloan. It was a project in one of my classes called iTeams, and I met this, incredible human being and a brilliant professor, Professor Doug Hart, who had recently sold his previous company to 3M for a lot of money, scanning. He basically built the world's first chairside digital dental scanning system. And so he had this other...
With Eric Paley?
With Eric Paley, yeah, exactly. Eric and Micah had co-founded with Professor Doug Hart, Brontes.
It all comes
and
together.
So Brontes, and then again the backstory, which could be interesting for some of the listeners, was like Doug had a thing for like Greek mythology, and so we just went down the list of all these Greek gods. Brontes was one. Then we went into, and Lantos is actually was the company name that we chose, which was like the god of wind and air sort of a thing. And so it's like whispering. And so the idea that it's about scanning ears and some interesting audio and applications that were possible with what we were doing. And so we basically built the world's first 3D digital scanning system for the human ear canal, and it would scan it from the inside out. So some interesting applications there. We raised about, I ran the company for about 4 years. We raised about $20+ million by the time I left. We were already in commercial sales. And what led me to my next venture was some interesting conversations that we had when we were, at Lantos, we had one of the world's most accurate data sets of the human ear canal. Mm-hmm. And these are dynamic ear canals. So about the same time, Apple was redesigning their earbuds. And the interesting backstory here is that the project lead was Professor Hart's student at Apple. And so he had heard about our work, and so he reached out to us and he said, hey, you guys are scanning ears. We're looking to, build some cool new designs. And so one thing led to another, but what was the key insight that I got from some of those early conversations with friends at Apple was like, it was apparent that the consumer world and the healthcare world were going to converge. So of all the other conversations and the key insights, and if they converge, it's going to, you're going to unlock a lot of value. And typically, these two worlds typically don't overlap because they're so different. Healthcare is super regulated, consumer is fast moving, break fast, and so it's so the next inspiration for my venture Qantas really came from some of the conversations I had with both very, very large, the world's largest consumer and healthcare companies. And the thesis emerged as actually right about that time, Qualcomm had announced their X Prize competition, which was this medical tricorder thing for $10 million. And so I was at CES representing, I was taking Lantos, and we were, meeting with all these potential customers, and it dawned on me that, if there's a place on the planet where you can build a medical tricorder, it should be Cambridge. And obviously, as a hardcore Trekkie, I couldn't resist. So I came back and I called a few professor friends, including Professor Ramesh Raskar, that we should do this. And so spend the next 6 months basically building a team, mapping out a system that could meet or exceed the X Prize requirements. But the key insight from that was that we could design a system that met the requirements for X Prize, but we felt like nobody would use it. It would be a big fax machine. And so we said, we shouldn't do that. We basically killed it. And we said, we're not going to do this. But one part of that system that we designed became the foundational IP for my next venture, which was Qantas. And this is before Apple Watch. This is before, Nike Fuel Band was really popular in those days, and Jawbone was just picking up, and Fitbit was. Those are the three key players. But it was very, very basic. And so the idea and the inspiration behind the next venture was, can we solve really important healthcare use cases using wearables?
Yeah, Qantas, I remember. Big splash, hardware, Coastal Adventures, right? So West Coast VC, and it was transformative at the time. So it was like continuous blood pressure monitoring, right?
Yeah. The story of Qantas is an interesting, and there are many lessons. We could talk forever, but I'll give you a very, So Qantas was ahead of its time, and we built the technology that eventually I think has moved the needle, is going to move the needle towards putting blood pressure on every smartwatch on the planet. And I think once that happens, it's going to be radical transformation for things like cardiovascular health in particular. So if you look at the number one use case for Apple Watch, which is the best-selling smartwatch on the planet, it's health. And the number one metric, the most valuable metric, let me put it this way, is your blood pressure or core metrics around your cardiovascular. And so that was the problem that we were solving. And the reason why we were, we ended up raising north of 30 million. We built a team both here in Kendall Square and Silicon Valley, and we hired some incredible people to do this. Unfortunately, we never released a product, and the technology ended up getting licensed out. But I think if you look back, if I look back at what we were able to do as a team, I think we were able to show people completely new insights, which are still actually still to be rolled out in the consumer market. So things like, connecting, I think we just saw the first FDA-approved application for sleep apnea on a smartwatch, for example. We were some of the first folks to file patents around some of those use cases. So, that was a case of we all felt like very bullish that we were on to something super meaningful, and this is going to be an extremely valuable company. But I think there's some interesting, important lessons learned there. We ended up raising a lot of money and with some really, really important investors as well.
All right. So what was next?
Having spent a good 4 years looking at non-invasive sensing, I spent a little bit of time thinking about the gold standard of medical diagnostics, and that's your blood chemistry, essentially. And I helped launch a company that was delivering and building some really compelling technologies around that. But the reason I never really moved into that direction was partly because the Theranos fallout at that point. So it became almost impossible to do anything of consequence and raise venture because of that that fallout. And so my journey took me basically. I parked myself at Harvard's Office of Technology Development, where I was an entrepreneur in residence. And the idea I was at that point pursuing was really looking at building a long-term stable human brain interface. with one of the top guys in the field, who was a professor at Harvard. But that conversation led me down the path of eventually starting a company with a collaborator from the same lab, and Professor Dr. Rudy Tanzi, who's the vice chair of neurology at Mass General Hospital, and Dr. Brian Nahid and Dr. Sean Patel. So they basically became my collaborators in starting React Neuro, which was basically using digital biomarkers for assessing these micro changes in our brain health, and can we predict and prevent these. So I went from non-invasive to looking at things on the invasive side, and then eventually back at using like digital biomarkers as really early onset of disease detection.
Yeah, it's such, just having a family going through dementia, it's brutal. So any progress towards solving that, I just always like to see science and companies being built to tackle. I mean, there's so many things to tackle, but that's certainly one that affects so many, and it's just can be cruel.
Yeah, I think if I look back, basically, there are two primary things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. One is cardiovascular health, our heart health, and the other one is brain health. And so these are the two biggest, I think, the brain is still the so mostly, still the final frontier, I guess, in medicine, right? In terms of solving for things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson. There haven't been, we haven't seen the level of breakthroughs that we've seen in cardiovascular, for example. We've seen radical shift in cardiovascular care. People don't expect to die, basically, of cardiovascular disease at this point. Most things can be solved for. But the brain part is still a mystery, and especially as we're moving closer and closer to precision medicine, as we're using these multi-omic sort of approaches, I think we're beginning to unlock a lot of these compelling opportunities, and this brings us back to essentially what we're kind of doing, what I'm doing today, which is it's the core thesis at C10 is applied AI for some of the biggest societal scale problems in core sectors of the economy, like healthcare, energy, fintech, enterprise.
So, and that's why I started the podcast by saying why you're uniquely qualified to be doing what you're doing with C10 is you just had all these experiences with universities, IP, building companies. AI is obviously in the early innings where it's a lot of figuring stuff out. So how did you get started? It's one thing to have this, coursework that you and your co-founders had, but to actually build like this venture studio and to have cohorts, there's a lot involved in actually making that happen.
Yeah, it is. It's a pretty complex structure, which both has its advantages and disadvantages. Especially if you're trying to raise funds, you want to keep your structure very simple. You want it very, familiar from an investor standpoint. So we spent a fair bit of time thinking about how we wanted to do this. And what is the structure that allowed us to move fast? Because this is a fast-moving industry. Things are moving really fast. And we wanted the ability to scale our impact through financial leverage. So we raise enough capital that allows us to, build multiple companies a year, invest in multiple companies a year. And so, we built basically C10 as a startup. If you think of, for the first year of our business, we basically stood up the accelerator program, and where we had over 40 companies go through 3 different cohorts. And our cohorts are a little different than some of the other programs that are out there. They're very specific to applied AI. So we have resources like AI fellows and engineers who work with our teams, really a deep bench of applied AI and go-to-market experts in AI who work with these early stage companies to fill the gaps on the teams so they can one, make sure they're pointed in the right direction. 2, they're building the right things and moving fast. And then the third piece is really that we bring in the potential customers which allows these teams to test and validate. So, it's really custom designed as a AI studio that can match the clock speed of the rate of change that we're all experiencing with AI these days. As I said, we did this very much like a startup. The first year was focused on accelerator. The last 6 months, we've been focused on standing up our studio operations, which basically means that we're now building our internally incubated ventures. So we have a handful of these companies that are in proto-venture stage, which are licensed technologies, typically where we're recruiting a team, founding team, where we're investing in the engineering and the build out all the way up to MVP and beyond. And we have 3 ventures right now in that program that are should be raising external capital, hopefully second half of this year. So, so it's been very ambitious, I think, given that we're still a small fund and we're still in the process of closing our first fund. But the way we've done this is really using first principles of saying, okay, we're asking our investors in the market to believe in us, but let's start by providing that evidence that this is possible. And so we started by generating that evidence for our investment thesis through our accelerator companies, and then now through our studio companies. So, we're kind of, in a way, practicing what we're preaching, which is, let's lead with data, let's lead with evidence, and, show our investors in the market that we're able to do compelling things at scale.
So for the accelerator piece, like what can entrepreneurs expect over that course of time?
So the program has evolved drastically over the last 3 cohorts, and we're about to start a 4th cohort in July. And the analogy that I've often given is that we think of the program itself as an F1 car. An F1 car gets rebuilt, 80-90% of the car is rebuilt every 6 months because it's so competitive that every element of the car and the engineering is getting optimized and fine-tuned. And it's all based on data, right? So everything is measured, everything is looked at, and how can we improve? And so we've had a very, very similar approach, very drastically, I think, different from other cohorts or other programs where it's a fairly static program. And perhaps, every few years people would say, okay, what can we do differently? Here, we're doing it often adjusting during the cohort, but then at the end of every cohort, what we've done is we've looked at what's worked, what hasn't worked, constantly optimizing resource allocation on our side, and the programming as well. So one thing we realized, for example, is that a key resource that was really required early in the life cycle of some of these companies was like an AI architect. It's hard for these startups to really figure out, like, there's so much noise in the market, there's so many different things that they can build with, but where do they place their core bets on infrastructure, tools, systems, trade-offs? And so bringing that resource early in the life cycle was really, really valuable. And so that's just one example.
Are there some companies of note to share that have gone through the program?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me give you a few examples. So the kind of companies we look for are solving hard, complex problems that typically would have some strong data moat, and obviously we look at all the usual checklists that a VC would look at. Amazing teams, some history of working together, and relevant experience. And so some of the teams so one team one venture called QMB, which basically has been working on applied AI for regulatory approvals with FDA. So if you're building a medical device, or if you're a pharma and you want to improve your quality, all the way from quality management to FDA filings, how do you improve your chances knowing all the data that exists and everything else that's been filed to date? So not only improving the odds of your FDA approval, but also making sure that you're compliant and doing it in a way that now, instead of needing 5 engineers on quality management, maybe you need 1. Right. So the scale of efficiencies is exponential. That's one good example. We've had teams working in legal tech, for example. We just had an incredible team called Fortuna Insight. They had one of the most had a top 10 AI paper actually this year in legal, and they've basically built an arbitration system, AI for arbitration. For any kind of business contract or transnational contract. So really, really interesting use case where there are complex dynamics at work, and typically would cost millions of dollars if you get it wrong. You can now do it very, very cost effectively. We've had teams doing a lot of work in healthcare, for example. Encore Health is another great company working on revenue cycle management, which is a huge pain point for healthcare providers. We have teams that are working on cardiovascular disease. So, for example, Guide AI, looking at CT imaging, and this is using targeting peripheral vascular disease, which is a massive typical miss on most scans. And so, if you can catch these patients early in their life cycle, not only can you give them many, many more years of higher quality of life, you can eventually prevent that disease to actually manifesting. And so you can do a lot of preventive care. So Guide AI is a fantastic example. The 2 radiologists out of Brigham who started this company and came to us with very early in their life cycle and went through our program, and have now, all of these companies have raised external capital, by the way. So, QMB just had their first round led by Bain Capital. And we have other companies like Boston Health AI that is basically, they've built a AI physician's assistant. They've raised their first $3.5 million in seed. They've got a lot of inbound traction. So those are just some of the examples that we've seen over the last couple of years.
Well, I noticed on your website you're accepting applications for your AI biology cohort this fall. So that's in collaboration with Lab Central too, right?
Yeah. So this is actually a really exciting chapter for us as we move forward, because what we're doing with Lab Central has basically never been done before in this way. So obviously there are venture funds who have the resources to do this, but in a model where, and this is thanks to State of Massachusetts Spark Grant, we were able to set up the first AI in the loop for a wet lab setup, which basically C10 will bring in the AI expertise very, very early in the life cycle of these biotechs and companies that are solving really hard, meaningful problems in across the value chain of biotech. So design, discovery to new cures, to even in some cases devices that are opening up fundamentally new opportunities. So it's a very, very exciting program, and we'll be bringing in about 15 companies this summer. The program's going to last about 10 weeks, and again, heavily represented by the local ecosystem and academic labs, but we accept teams from everywhere.
Yeah, which I wanted to clarify that, because I do know there are some entities that are leaning heavily into the academic institution, companies that are coming out of Harvard, MIT, or wherever, Tufts, Northeastern. But there's obviously things outside of the academic institutions too that are building. So, like, one of the things that I think Boston has struggled with throughout my whole career of supporting the Boston tech ecosystem is having more like noise, right? Like more awareness of all the amazing things going on. Like, I think people always relate Boston to that academic side, and maybe founders start to build their company, but maybe they go off to San Francisco because there's greater resources of capital, or they go to New York or something like that. So, like, what are you seeing, and like, what could Boston do better as far as making things so well known that there's liquid AI, Suno, like the liquid AI example? They probably had the splashiest launch I've ever seen for a Boston company, where I was like, okay, this is a good example of a launch. It was very well done.
Yeah. So some of this is cultural, right? Like, I feel like Boston, like, people in Boston like to work on really tough problems. They would rather lead with the work rather than with the press release. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is a strong bias there. However, I think it's super important that we do talk about the good work that's going on, and and it's done at scale. Scale is really important. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, if you can't scale a platform or an offering, ultimately it doesn't matter. Because the only way you can translate to impact is that if you can scale your product or service in some meaningful way. And so that definitely involves making sure that you're presenting the work in a compelling way. I think Liquid did a fantastic job. But we definitely, there's a lot of headroom for similar stories to emerge, right? A lot of these companies end up moving out of Boston, New York, San Francisco. But I do think that the mindset and the ecosystem has changed a lot over the last 5 years, especially. I do think that there are a lot more open innovation sort of opportunities. BioHub is a great example, where maybe some of the top VCs in the world had these facilities internally, but being able to do it now in a where it's democratized and any team can apply, I think is fantastic. That's one example. But I completely agree that Boston can do a better job. But having said that, I think things have changed a lot. The number of activation events around, or number of activation organizations in AI, since even when we started, which was there weren't any, right? Now we're seeing every week there are multiple hackathons. There associations that are running these programs, bringing awareness. I think that the tide is changing, but perhaps one can argue that it's not changing fast enough, or we're not seeing these massive outliers emerge from the ecosystem that are going out and raising, a few $1 billion. Some of this is actually on the kinds of problems that we're working on as well. Because if you look at the infrastructure investment requirements, that's where the super big dollars are going, right? So if you look at the applied AI layer, you don't necessarily need $100 million, right? And you can do a lot with a lot less. So as much as one wants to see these, massive, financings and scale, but I think what's interesting about AI is that we will be surprised at how much value, just a very, very small team can create with how little capital. And when they get the product fit right, and when they've got something that the world really, really needs, and they're able to tap into it and ride that wave. And I think that's what we're trying to do with fast experimentation on the applied AI side. So that's kind of basically our thesis. Our thesis at C10 is we want to invest in the most consequential companies in the AI applied AI layer, and we think Boston is going to have its share of wins, just by the sheer size of its human capital, the ecosystem, venture dollars, and we want to make sure that we are able to support some of these wins.
I mean, healthcare, the whole industry has so much opportunity for disruption. Life sciences, pharmaceutical. There's so many opportunities, biotech. So I think Boston has an edge there that hopefully it does capitalize in that sector. Cybersecurity, and then marketing, right? MarTech, right? Like HubSpot and Klaviyo, like we have anchor companies that there should be the next generation companies, native AI, that are building in those sectors that have a strategic advantage with the talent pool, the rich history. So I'm not stopping the buck in those industries, but there's certainly strong industries to build off of. So, sometimes it takes a while, but I agree the whole $1 billion investments going towards the infrastructure layer is just, that's a different world of complexity and resources. So if I was the one in charge of leading the AI initiatives, I definitely would let that be, the Valley or whoever's building those companies. All right. So you've seen a lot of companies now, and you've built companies, and you talked about one of the stumbling blocks for startups building in this new world of AI is, AI architect. What else are you seeing? Like, what are the stumbling blocks in the early stages of this platform shift?
I think it's there are a couple of things, recurring themes. One is, teams finding the right talent in AI. I think talent, it's all about the quality of talent and people who've done things before, ship product at a compelling scale. I mean, those are really valuable skills because, at every different tier of scale, you have different sets of learnings and challenges and opportunities. And so being able to bring some of those capabilities very early in the life cycle of a venture, I think it can unlock a lot of value, which is one of the things that we do. The other thing I would say, so one is like everybody's chasing all talent. The other piece is I think the rate of change is so high that often teams struggle to figure out basic trade-offs as they're thinking about building, which platform, which architecture, tools, systems, and so. And also, I think the speed, just for teams to be on the cutting edge, there's they have to really be clued in, and so I think that's tough. But again, it's always a trade-off between heads down, building stuff, and I think if you can accelerate at the speed of iteration, that's the way to solve for that, rather than trying to keep building till you get it perfect. I think right now we're in a world where it's just completely different physics of venture creation. What used to take weeks takes days and hours, and you just have to make sure that you're not anchored in any legacy thinking about what's possible, because all of the rules of the game have changed in terms of product engineering and product iteration.
All right, so some rapid fire questions. 3 apps you can't live without, can't be Slack, email, or your calendar.
Apps?
Or resources. It doesn't have to be an actual app.
Yeah, I would say there's a few podcasts that I tap into for precision medicine that I definitely I track Eric Topol quite religiously in terms of what's around the corner. I think it's for me it's less about maybe the apps, but it's more about seeing what's getting published in AI from a foundational standpoint. So just trying to understand how the dots connect and then being able to extrapolate and help some of our teams with that, I think is really, really important. So I would say those 2 things. I do look at, what's getting published in some of the journals, and then broadly in precision medicine tends to be a little bit of my hobby.
What do you like to do outside of work, outside of, reading the journals?
Yeah, it's these days not much, but I am an avid sort of a squash is my go-to game, and then during the summers I prefer being on the courts outside and on tennis. So those are my little distractions. But yeah.
Cool. Well, Shahid, thanks so much for taking the time to walk us through your background story, obviously all the great work you and your team at C10 Labs are up to, and obviously all the great advice.
Thank you so much, Keith. This has been a pleasure. It was great talking to you. And I think you really brought some of the stories out that I haven't thought about in a long time. So it was fascinating to sort of take a moment and reflect, but hopefully it was useful. And thank you again for the opportunity. This was fun.